Welcome. This chapter covers the final period of the Judean monarchy from 695 to 608 before the Common Era, a time of religious upheaval, reform, and political challenge. Following Hezekiah, Manasseh ascended the throne, reversing many of his father's reforms. He reintroduced Assyrian religious practices, promoted idolatry, and persecuted the prophets who had supported Hezekiah's policies. His reign also saw continued Assyrian influence, including interactions with Esarhaddon and Manasseh. Ammon ruled briefly, maintaining similar policies. The kingdom's fortunes began to shift under Josiah, who initiated a major religious revival. Guided by prophets such as Huldah and Zephaniah, Josiah repaired the temple, reintroduced proper worship, and enforced adherence to the laws found in the book of Deuteronomy. His reforms culminated in a nationally observed Passover, symbolizing renewed devotion to Yahweh. Politically, Josiah navigated the declining influence of Assyria while asserting Judah's independence. His reign ended at the Battle of Megiddo, marking the close of a pivotal era in Judean history and the last strong attempt at centralized reform before the kingdom's final decline. The Judean nation, which had known the discipline and prosperous reign of King Hezekiah, was not to enjoy unbroken happiness for even a single generation. Following his death, rapid reversals of fortune tested the strength and cohesion of the kingdom. What had been peace and stability under Hezekiah soon gave way to disorder and disunion, and the flourishing of culture and faithfulness to ancient Israelitish traditions was replaced by moral corruption and schism. These internal divisions, born of jealousy and resentment among the princes, nobles, and rural populations, brought lasting weakness to the state. Hezekiah's son, Manasseh, ascended the throne in the year 695 before the Common Era, at the age of 12. Such youth, when combined with governance in the hands of ministers and advisers, made the kingdom vulnerable to ambition, avarice, and unscrupulous desires. The princes of Judah, embittered by the neglect they had suffered during Hezekiah's reign, were eager to restore their former influence and take revenge on those who had displaced them. The courtiers and officers who assumed power under the young king devoted themselves chiefly to overturning the reforms and centralization of worship that Hezekiah had enforced. Hezekiah's policies had been based on the Israelitish doctrines of the unity of God, the incorporeality of the divine, the rejection of all idolatry, and the establishment of centralized worship in Jerusalem. The faction that seized control under Manasseh, composed of zealous adversaries of Hezekiah's legacy, pursued the deliberate dismantling of the system. Their motives were a mixture of passion, resentment, imitation of foreign customs, and sheer hatred of Israelitish tradition. The nobles, who were entrusted with the care of the young king, initiated a sweeping program of idolatrous practices. They legalized the use of high places, which Hezekiah had condemned, and reintroduced wild religious orgies both within Jerusalem and in the temple itself. Not only were the ancient Canaanite rites revived, but Assyrian and Babylonian religious customs were incorporated into worship as if in deliberate affront to the God of Israel. In the temple courtyards, altars were constructed in honor of Baal, the Canaanite storm and fertility god, and Astarte, the goddess of fertility and war. Smaller altars were placed on the roofs of houses for veneration of the 5 planets, reflecting astrological influences imported from neighboring cultures. A large image, referred to as Semel, was erected in the temple, probably representing the Assyrian goddess Mylitta, the deity of love and fertility, as a provocative challenge to Israelite devotion. The moral consequences of these religious innovations were even more destructive than the idolatry itself. Temple servants and priestesses, known as Kedushath, led lives of licentious indulgence in cells provided for them. In the valley of Ben Hinnom, the pyre, called Tophath, was revived, and children were cast into the flames as sacrifices to Moloch, a god believed to avert calamity. Every act was designed to erase the memory and authority of the God of Israel. To strengthen the idolatrous faction, priests from outside the Aaronic lineage, called Cameron, were brought into Judah to officiate in the temple alongside traditional priests, echoing the practices established by Queen Jezebel and Queen Athaliah generations earlier. False prophets appeared in numbers, giving voice to these abominations and defending them as legitimate or even virtuous. Habit, compulsion, and imitation allowed this corruption to spread from the palace and court to the wider land, undermining the ethical and spiritual foundations of Judah. If left unchecked, This degeneration threatened not only the obliteration of Israelitish traditions, but also the destruction of the nation destined to carry blessings and knowledge to the broader human world. In Jerusalem, despite the corruption and idolatry promoted by the court, there existed a steadfast party devoted to the law of God, the law which the king and nobles scorned. These men and women formed a stark contrast to the representatives of idolatry and foreign customs. They were determined to preserve their convictions, even if it cost them their lives. Among them were the disciples of the prophet Isaiah, whom he had instructed and nurtured as though they were his own children. Known as the long-suffering Anavim, small in number and humble in social rank, their resolve made them a formidable force. They were sometimes called the Anavites, the prophetic party, and referred to themselves as the community of the upright in the sacred language, Zod Jesharm W. Eda. Under King Manasseh, these devoted followers endured tremendous hardships. The men whom King Hezekiah had appointed as judges and officers of state were removed by the court faction, and Aaronites of the family of Zadok, the high priestly lineage, who refused to partake in the idolatrous worship, were dismissed from the temple and deprived of their incomes from sacrifices and offerings. Prophets denounced these injustices, and members of this community expressed horror at the audacity of the court party. Yet Manasseh and the princes of Judah acted with ruthless cruelty, silencing the voices of prophets with blood, reminiscent of the deeds of Jezebel, the infamous queen of Israel. The prophetic writings of this period were largely lost, as the men of God either perished before they could record their words or were forced to veil them in cryptic language. Historians of the time left scant record of public events, leaving many acts of importance in obscurity. One event of international consequence occurred during Manasseh's reign. One of Sennacherib's sons, the parricidal murderer of the proud Assyrian king, had ascended the throne of Nineveh but was himself killed violently by his brother Esarhaddon. Esarhaddon, reigning from 680 to 668 before the Common Era, exploited the turmoil and civil war in Babylonia to subjugate that ancient land, reducing it to dependency on Assyria. Strengthened by this conquest, he launched a military campaign against Egypt, a land his father had failed to secure. Some of his generals landed on the coast of Judah, intent on subduing King Manasseh through threats and intimidation. Manasseh traveled to meet Esarhaddon to negotiate peace, but was taken captive and led in chains to Babylon, an ominous sign for the house of David, which had strayed from its faithfulness and shown an uncritical admiration for foreign powers. It is believed that Sennacherib's son settled prisoners from conquered lands, including Babylon, Cutha, Sepharvaim, and Hamath, in Samaria to colonize it. At the time, this seemed insignificant to Judah, but it would prove decisive in the future. These exiles, known as Scythians for their origins and Samaritans for their new dwellings, gradually adopted Israelite customs, influenced by the small remnant of Israelites remaining after the destruction of the northern kingdom of the 10 tribes. The Scythians made pilgrimages to holy sites at Bethel, where Israelite priests performed religious services, yet they continued idolatrous practices, including human sacrifices. Manasseh was eventually released from captivity and returned to Judah under the authority of Esarhaddon or his successor. Yet his character remained corrupt, idolatrous worship, immorality, and cruel persecution persisted until his death in 641 before the Common Era. Unlike his forefathers, he did not seek burial in the city of David, the traditional resting place of the kings, but in the garden of Uzzah, adjoining the royal palace in the suburb of Millo. By choosing this location, he tacitly acknowledged himself unworthy to rest among the ancestors of David. Manasseh was succeeded by his eldest son, Ammon, who reigned from 640 to 639 before the Common Era. Though older than his father had been at accession, he showed no greater aptitude for kingship. The idolatrous customs and moral corruption that had flourished under Manasseh persisted, yet Ammon does not appear to have persecuted the prophetic party. His reign was brief, and little is known of his deeds or sentiments. The captain of the palace and chief courtiers conspired against him, assassinating him within his own palace. The nation, however, rose in rebellion against the conspirators, executing them and placing Ammon's 8-year-old son, Josiah, on the throne in 638 before the Common Era. During the early years of Josiah's reign, the nobles and princes of Judah maintained control, ruling in the name of the young king and continuing the idolatrous reforms instituted under Manasseh. Yet the number of faithful adherents, the sufferers of the land who clung to the precepts of the God of Israel, grew steadily. From this circle, new prophets arose under Josiah, speaking words of fire to proclaim the pure doctrines of God and striving to restore righteousness. Among these was the prophetess Huldah, whose counsel was highly sought, reminiscent of the leadership of Deborah in earlier times. Zephaniah, the eldest of the later prophets, hailed from a respected family of Jerusalem, whose lineage was known for 4 generations. Zephaniah openly denounced the moral weakness, idolatry, and foreign customs embraced by the nobles and princes. Following in the tradition of Amos and Joel, he predicted the advent of the terrible day of the Lord, a day of darkness and calamity. In his prophecies concerning other nations, he especially foretold the total destruction of Nineveh, the proud capital of Assyria. At this time, the slow decline of Assyria's power had begun. The nations that had remained faithful to the Assyrian kings now withdrew their allegiance, either of their own accord or compelled by the rising power of the Medes. The second king of Media, Frewarts, also known as Fravarch, waged campaigns that brought entire nations under his control, including the Persians, and together with these forces he advanced against the Assyrian capital of Nineveh. Despite being deserted by many of their former allies, the Assyrians remained strong and martial enough to defeat the Median army in 635 before the Common Era, during which Frewarts was killed. Frewart's son, Cyaxares, a king even more daring and adventurous than his father, quickly raised a great army to avenge his death. He organized his forces according to the armor and weaponry of different units and launched a campaign against Assyria. Cyaxares achieved a decisive victory over the Assyrian army and advanced to lay siege to Nineveh in 634 before the Common Era. Yet before the siege could conclude, countless hordes of Scythians invaded Media, forcing Cyaxares to lift the siege. Unable to defeat these northern raiders in open battle, he secured their withdrawal only by paying an enormous tribute. The Scythians, having moved westward, reached the lands of Phoenicia, advancing along the coastal towns of Philistia, and soon stood threatening the frontier of Egypt. The pharaoh Psammetichus, king of Egypt, met them with rich gifts and persuasive entreaties, and they agreed to abandon their intended invasion. Some of the Scythian warriors turned northward, while others moved into Asia Minor, and a portion remained in Philistia, overrunning the land and burning the temple of Milea, the Assyrian goddess of debauchery. From Philistia, they swept into the neighboring territory of Judah, devastating towns and villages, seizing cattle, and spreading terror. Jerusalem, however, appears to have been spared, likely because the youthful King Josiah of Judah, together with the steward of his palace, met the raiders and appeased them by surrendering treasures. This period of terror, with constant reports of destruction and slaughter, deeply affected the inhabitants of Judah. Where the words of the prophets had previously fallen on deaf ears, the fulfillment of those warnings now revealed the folly of idolatrous worship. If the gods of Assyria, Babylon, Phoenicia, or Philistia could not protect their own peoples from the Scythians, how could foreign idols preserve Judah? The soul of King Josiah, gentle, pious, and naturally susceptible, was profoundly stirred. Though he had followed idolatrous practices out of habit, he had never fully embraced the corrupt worship of the times. The events around him revealed that he and his nation had strayed into crooked paths. Even so, Josiah did not immediately act to eradicate idol worship in Jerusalem. The princes of Judah held real power and were deeply attached to these practices. A heroic resolve was needed to challenge them, and the young king had not yet found the courage. The prophetic party took up the work of urging him toward decisive action, calling him back to the worship of God and the abandonment of foreign rites. His first steps were measured. He focused on the restoration of the holy temple of the Lord, which had fallen into decay. Its walls, halls, and outbuildings were cracking, the decorations were defaced, and the sanctuary itself was threatened. King Josiah recalled the priests and Levites from exile to resume service in the temple in 627 before the Common Era. He commanded them to collect contributions for its renovation, placing the high priest Hilkiah at their head, a man whose house had not been corrupted by idolatry. Yet the treasury was insufficient. The love of the wealthy for the temple had cooled, and the nation had been impoverished by the recent Scythian invasions. Contributions had to be actively solicited, and Levitic emissaries went from house to house in city and country, gathering gifts to restore the sanctuary. Even as the temple was repaired, Josiah remained hesitant to confront the errors of idolatry fully. Some nobles returned outwardly to the worship of Jehovah, swearing allegiance, yet continued to practice idolatry privately. It required further impetus to awaken the king's resolve. That impetus came from 2 sources: the voice of a prophet, who spoke with powerful and irresistible language, and a sacred book revealing the courage and righteousness required of a king. The prophet was Jeremiah, known to the world as Jeremiah, son of Hilkiah, born between 645 and 640 before the Common Era, and destined to die between 580 and 570 before the Common Era. He came from the small town of Anathoth in the territory of the tribe of Benjamin. Jeremiah was neither poor nor wealthy, but he was connected to landed relatives, including his uncle Shallum and the latter's son Hanamiel. Jeremiah's soul was rich and pure, reflecting clarity like a deep wellspring. Gentle by nature and inclined toward melancholy, he was deeply moved by the moral and religious corruption surrounding him, even from his youth. Everything false, perverse, or unworthy repelled him and filled him with sorrow. It was Jeremiah's voice, strengthened by this moral sensitivity, that would guide King Josiah to greater resolve, shaping the young king's understanding of justice, faith, and devotion to God. From the moment he began his sacred work, Jeremiah, son of Hilkiah, faced the burning hatred of his countrymen, the priests of Anathoth, a town in the territory of Benjamin. Their persecution was so fierce that it seems impossible they could have influenced the formation of his character. Yet Jeremiah's mind had already been shaped by the writings of the elder prophets. The teachings and legacies of these earlier seers filled him with exalted ideas of God, a profound understanding of moral order and human events, and a recognition of the importance of Israel's past and its significance for the future. They also instilled in him a deep aversion to what was base and corrupt. Following the divine call, he entered upon his prophetic mission, eventually initiating others in Anathoth or in Jerusalem into the ways of the Lord. Jeremiah's own account of his initiation, recorded in the first chapter of his book, stands in contrast to the more poetic introduction of Isaiah. The times demanded a different kind of eloquence. Moral degradation had taken a firm hold on the nation, and ruin loomed unless swift intervention occurred. Unlike prophets before him, who often spoke to a small, cultured audience, Jeremiah addressed large gatherings, princes, nobles, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and the people of Judah alike. Figures of speech and elaborate rhetoric would have been wasted. Clarity and precision were essential to make an impact. His words were primarily simple prose, punctuated occasionally by rhetorical flourishes. The threats of punishment and promises of salvation offered by previous prophets, with the exception of Isaiah, had often been vague, leaving the people of Jerusalem scornful and indifferent. Jeremiah's task was to counteract the scorn and awaken the nation to urgent moral and spiritual reality. His prophetic gift surpassed those of his predecessors, even Isaiah. At first, he prophesied from year to year. As calamity approached, he began to predict events from month to month with remarkable accuracy. He did not see visions in the uncertain haze of dreams, but in broad daylight, fully aware of the world around him. He called things by their true names, leaving no place for hidden meanings or enigmas. This pure prophetic spirit was entrusted with the heavy responsibility of rousing a perverse nation that had been straying for nearly half a century, precisely as the king of Judah began to awaken from his own lethargy. The moment Jeremiah received his divine call, his natural diffidence and gentleness vanished. He describes the overwhelming force of the prophetic spirit upon him, saying, "Is not my word like as a fire, saith the Lord, and like a hammer that shivereth the rock?" Jeremiah 23rd, 29th. His first fiery message denounced the nation's departure from its traditions, the abominations of idolatry, and the recurring cycles of bloodshed, as recorded in Jeremiah chapter 2. Such words from a young prophet made an immediate impact. Some noble families abandoned their immoral ways and returned to the worship of the God whom Jeremiah and the other prophets proclaimed. The family of Shaphan, a prominent household with influence at court, became active supporters of the prophetic cause. Meanwhile, King Josiah, recognizing the need to restore the temple, committed himself earnestly to its renovation. In the year 621 before the Common Era, he instructed three of his chief officers, Shaphan, Masseh, the governor of the city, and Joe, the royal chancellor, to summon the high priest Hilkiah and collect the funds held under his supervision to pay for building materials and the wages of laborers. When Hilkiah surrendered the funds, he also handed over a large scroll, saying, "I have found the book of the law in the temple." Shaphan read it in, profoundly moved, and informed the king of its discovery. This book, the last testament of Moses, contained not only laws but a historical introduction and epilogue, linking Israel's past to its future. Unlike many legal codes, which are stern and punitive, this text addressed the people with the gentle authority of a loving father, urging them to obedience for the sake of a bright future. It combined laws mizvath, statutes chekin, and ordinances mispatim with historical narratives and heartfelt admonitions and sublime, poetic language. Contained within the scroll was a hymn, attributed to Moses, warning that prosperity could lead the nation to false gods, and that a depraved people would be called to judgment. Only God, who had the power to kill and make alive, wound and heal, would ultimately vindicate and purify the land. The scroll detailed the severe punishments awaiting disobedience, sterility, famine, drought, pestilence, humiliation, oppression, slavery, and disgrace. The cumulative effect of these calamities, physical and spiritual, could drive a people to despair, madness, or idiocy. Through this vivid, unflinching account, Jeremiah's generation glimpsed the grave consequences of straying from the covenant, understanding that only through obedience and devotion could Israel hope to endure. The discovery of a peculiar book of the law in the temple of Jerusalem became a turning point in the reign of King Josiah. The priest Hilkiah had found the scroll and read its contents to Shaphan, the royal scribe, who, understanding its significance, hastened to bring it before the king. King Josiah, upon hearing the words of the newly recovered book, was struck with terror and grief. The text depicted in vivid terms the trespasses of the nation and the punishments that would follow disobedience. Conscience-stricken and shaken by the realization of the nation's failings, he tore his garments in anguish and sought counsel from the high priest Hilkiah. Hilkiah advised that the king consult the prophetess Huldah, the wife of Shallum, the overseer of the royal wardrobe and one of the officers of the court. Huldah confirmed to King Josiah that the impending calamities foretold in the book would not occur during his own lifetime, for he had repented and would guide the people back to righteousness. Comforted by this assurance, King Josiah committed himself with unwavering energy to the regeneration of Judah. He used the book of the law as his guiding principle, enforcing reforms far more thorough than those of his ancestor, King Hezekiah. He summoned the elders from all the cities of Judah, the priests and prophets, and even the lowliest workers of the temple, the woodcutters and water drawers, to gather in Jerusalem. There, in the temple, he personally stood on a raised platform as the passages of the law were read aloud, ensuring that the entire nation understood its duties, the blessings of obedience, and the consequences of transgression. King Josiah then proposed a covenant, binding all present to uphold the ordinances of the law with full commitment of heart and soul. At the conclusion, he proclaimed that those who abandoned the law would be cursed, and the assembly responded with a unanimous Amen. With authority now firmly established, King Josiah commanded the high priest Hilkiah, the priests responsible for temple maintenance, and the Levitical guardians of the temple gates to purify the sacred precincts from idolatrous worship. Every trace of idol worship was removed. The altars and figures of the start, the cells of the priestesses, the instruments of Baal worship, the sun horses at the entrance, and the altars for the stars were destroyed, burned in the vale of Kidron, and the ashes scattered over graves. The horrific altar in the vale of Ben Hinnom, where children had been sacrificed to Moloch, was desecrated by royal order, and all prominent idolatrous altars across the land were razed. This campaign of purification extended to Bethel, where the Chaldeans had settled and where remnants of Israel had maintained sanctuaries, as well as to towns formerly belonging to Samaria. Idolatrous priests were deposed, while priests of Levitical descent were confined to Jerusalem, where they could be supervised, and, although prohibited from offering sacrifices, they still received their share of the tithes. Foreign priests were expelled from the country, and in Bethel, the priests who had continued the worship of the golden bull introduced by King Jeroboam were executed upon the altars, which were defiled with human remains. The king himself led the desecration at Bethel, ensuring that the place of initial rebellion against God's law was decisively punished. In this campaign, Josiah acted in strict accordance with the precepts contained in the book of Deuteronomy. In the spring of the same year, 621 before the Common Era, King Josiah summoned the nation to celebrate the Passover in Jerusalem, following the ordinances of the law. The people obeyed, having sworn to uphold its mandates. The festival was solemnized with inspiring psalms sung by the Levitical choir, which exhorted the Aaronite priests to praise the God of Jacob, to remember the persecutions they had endured, the deliverance from Egypt, and the revelation at Mount Sinai, and to keep themselves free from foreign idols. They reminded the nation of the exile of part of Israel and prophesied happiness for those who adhered to the law. The zeal of Josiah and the removal of idolatry marked so profound a turning point that the prophets dated a new epoch from that year. The abominations of idolatry, which had corrupted Judah for 70 years, were eradicated, and social conditions improved. Hebrew slaves who had served 6 years were liberated, and impartial judges were appointed to protect the poor and helpless against the powerful. Josiah, more than any king before him, faithfully returned the nation to God, enforcing the laws of Moses with vigor. He also demonstrated political courage, asserting Judah's independence even against the influence of Egypt. During this period, the prophet Jeremiah began his ministry, foretelling widespread ruin and devastation, followed by a new order of things. The change foretold by Jeremiah commenced in the final years of King Josiah's reign. The once mighty empire of Assyria, which had subdued countless nations, was destined for destruction, and in its place, new empires would rise to power, reshaping the political landscape of the Near East. The nations surrounding Judah and Assyria were quick to act as the Assyrian Empire weakened. Media and Babylon, two of the closest dependencies of Nineveh, took vengeance for the past offenses inflicted upon them by the proud and imperious Assyrian city. In Babylon, a daring and ambitious leader, Nabopolassar, reigning from 625 to 605 before the Common Era, broke the last bonds that had tied his kingdom to Assyria and declared the independence of Babylon. Meanwhile, Egypt sought to exploit Assyria's decline. A bold king named Necho, also called Nekos or Nekai, son of Samatich, ascended the Egyptian throne and resolved to restore the former glory and power of his nation. King Necho assembled a vast army with the strategic aim of conquering the territory of the Lebanon mountains and extending his dominion as far as the mighty Euphrates River. He intended to humiliate Assyria and reestablish Egyptian influence over the Levant. His forces first captured the fortified Philistine city of Gaza, a key stronghold on the Mediterranean coast. From there, he advanced along the coastal slopes, intending to reach the Jordan River through the fertile plain of Jezreel. But the young king Josiah of Judah, determined to protect the territories that had once belonged to the Israelites, confronted Necho's advancing army. When the Egyptian army reached the middle of the plain of Jezreel, the troops of Judah barred their path at the strategic location of Megiddo, a city long known for its military significance. The Egyptian king reportedly assured Josiah that his campaign was not directed against Judah, but rather against more distant lands. Despite these assurances, Josiah compelled Necho to fight. The confrontation proved disastrous for Judah. Josiah's forces were defeated, and the king himself sustained mortal wounds in the battle of 608 before the Common Era. His attendants hastily carried their injured sovereign back to Jerusalem, but the wounds proved fatal, and on his arrival, he drew his last breath. Josiah was interred in a new royal mausoleum, and the grief of the people was profound. Men and women wept bitterly for their fallen king, crying out in lamentation, "O king! O glory!" Each year, on the anniversary of his death, a mourning song was performed, composed by the prophet Jeremiah specifically to commemorate the loss of this exemplary ruler of the house of David. Josiah's death marked a decisive turning point in the history of Judah, signaling the end of an era of righteous and capable leadership, and foreshadowing the growing peril that awaited the kingdom.